Love it or hate it, Archnemesis is here to stay, and rare monsters will never be the same. As a league mechanic in 3.17, I personally found it to be rather tedious, especially because I always got a lot more fragments than I actually wanted to use, or even could. If you were doing reasonably juiced content, you'd have to use your loot filter to sort through, because you'd be getting 6 to 8 fragments a map, and you could only ever use 4. The idea of building a monster and then fighting it was kinda cool, but it really felt a little bit like Metamorph 2 Electric Boogaloo. As of 3.18, Archnemesis is a lot more streamlined, which is to say, Archnemesis modifiers now appear on all rares, and they've gotten some individual adjustments. One of the goals with this change was to replace outdated Nemesis and Bloodline systems, looking at you cast on death effects, along with updating the visuals to make them a lot clearer, which is something that I have a lot of thoughts on, some good and some bad. Archnemesis is far from perfect, and I don't expect to see too many more improvements during 3.18, since we've already had several over the past month, and this is when GGG starts to focus on future content more than adjusting current content. So as long as everything's functional, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see more tweaks to Archnemesis until the 3.19 patch notes. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that shouldn't be addressed. So what are some of the biggest issues that I've run into, both with Archnemesis and also rare monsters in general? First of all, Effigy. It's able to spawn off screen, and the link to the player is such a faint effect that very often it's completely hidden in the blur of colors that passes for normal Path of Exile gameplay. So, much like old Reflect, sometimes you just fall over dead, and you won't realize until it's too late that you died to an effigy. At least until you get to the point where you're able to instantly obliterate the entire screen in a microsecond. I did effigy maybe twice during 3.17, and in both cases it wasn't too bad, so this was definitely a mod that I severely underestimated going into 3.18. It feels like the worst combination of old Reflect, where you die without any sort of visual indication, and the worst aspect of Proximity Shield, where it hurts some builds way more than others, and those builds often aren't the intended target. I don't really think there's a great way to fix effigy, so I'd be fine if it was just completely removed, or the name was kept and it was reworked to do something entirely different, like make a totem that shares health with a monster so the monster takes reduced damage. Another modifier that currently feels a little too problematic is Abrath Touched. The reflection of Abrath is summoned and uses its rather lethal Meteor Storm. This is fairly easy to dodge, except for the fact that the little circles on the ground are hidden by all the ground effects. And I mean, if you're not running a Consecrated Ground Desecrated map with burning ground patches, are you really playing Path of Exile? Sometimes I'm moving in a direction and I see the reflection mid-cast. Other times I just get hit, and then notice there's fire raining around me. A simple fix here would be to reduce the range of the ability, or cause the reflection to spawn within a certain distance of the player. If you can see the summon, it is fairly easy to manage. Just get off the screen. Now, when it comes to content-specific problems, Delve stands out as being the worst offender. Some Archnemesis modifiers are much more difficult to deal with given the enemy scaling in Delve, and this would have been a great time to address the fact that you could often get teleported to your death in the darkness if you're wearing a headhunter while delving. Unlike during a map, where if something spawns that is just truly abhorrent, you can run past it. In Delve, you're kind of stuck, because if it spawns on your node endpoint, you have to kill it, or you're not going to succeed. I mean, you could waste the Sulfite and skip the node entirely by redoing it, but that feels really bad as well. I've also noticed some pretty odd combinations during Blighted or Blight Ravaged maps that feel overly oppressive. But in both of these cases, limiting the pool that could spawn in these areas or from these mechanics would go a long way to solve the problem. The last issue is Essence monsters. These kind of suck, especially when you're undergeared. And they don't have to. The simple fix here is allow you to see what Archnemesis modifiers the rare possesses before you do something like corrupt the 8-mod Essence monster to now have Horror and Delirium on top of all of its other mods. But sometimes the issue is just seeing the effect and not seeing the monster. I've found this to be the case, especially with things like Toxic when you're using a Mirage Archer. Now, maybe it's just me, but green on green just doesn't stand out that well, but at the very least, as long as you have Chaos Res cap, it shouldn't kill you instantly. On the other hand, Malediction and Executioner are deadly, and they're almost impossible to see in a hectic fight. Usually I can tell I'm near a Malediction aura because I get the debuff on me, and then lose half of my health. Usually I can tell that I'm near an Executioner because I lose half of my health. In both cases, I very much wouldn't want to be playing hardcore. But it's not all bad. Archnemesis does have some upsides, and I'm going to talk about those. But before I do, a quick reminder that if you've been enjoying the video, please do leave a like, as that really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. If you want to see more content, then sub to the channel and ring the bell to be notified whenever I upload. Or, for non-Path of Exile stuff, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, where I'm going to be talking gaming news in the near future. Special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for their continued support, but more about that at the end. For now, let's start talking blasphemy, and by that, I mean the upsides of Archnemesis. The first of which is, the color coding of enemy mods is great, because it means if you're short on chaos res, you need to keep an eye out for purple. If you're dealing physical damage, then you need to keep an eye out for kind of steely gray. In the past, we've seen oddly colored enemy modifiers, such as the strange gray that Delirium uses, and if anything, that makes them much harder to read. To me, they all just kind of look the same, like gray, squiggly, blurry lines. But so far, I found Archnemesis much easier to read, and while some of the specifics of modifiers are a bit complex, you can at least get an idea by glancing at the name how it will work. Steel infused, well, that probably has something to do with physical. Flame Strider, probably something to do with fire. Malediction works exactly like the Occultist node, but way stronger. I still think it's a bit difficult to know exactly what monsters do, especially without consulting the list that GGG released on their site and on Reddit, and so I'd love to see a little bit more clarity here, such as releasing this information in the game journal. Or even the bestiary. Now, there's a few modifiers which do share the same colors, but luckily, modifiers aren't the only way to tell Archnemesis apart. Instead, a lot of enemies also have unique animations which bring a great deal of visual clarity to what the monster's doing. Sentinel fires little shields at you. Mana Siphoner has a giant blue donut of death, and these stand out to me as being a lot easier to see than the things that the old rares did. The fact that a lot of these monsters are more dangerous also does help make them a little bit more memorable. If you see Rejuvenator Pulse Green, run away. If you see an Executioner Aura, don't stand in it, but it might be blending into the ground effects, so do be careful on that one. For Mana Siphoner, either stand directly on top of the enemy or run far away. Once you get the hang of these mechanics, many of the new rares become quite easy to deal with. But these mods don't just make enemies stronger, they also make inspired learning far better. In the past, you'd steal one modifier, which means inspired learning would only make the biggest difference on top of the Headhunter. Now, because modifiers don't stack, there's no reason to use them together, but inspired learning stands out as an amazing budget option that gets you a ton of defensive power for currently a price of about 1.2x. Before you know it, you'll be stealing max res, spell suppression, stun immunity, and much more. And if you do happen to put on the full Headhunter, then those defensive bonuses get even more powerful, especially when doing rare dense content. So overall, Headhunter and stealing mods from monsters are in a really good spot. Now that I've talked about the good and the bad, all that's left is the ugly. Or maybe all that's left is my thoughts on Archnemesis as a whole and what I'd like to see for the future. Now, especially after the monster diversity changes, I do think Archnemesis is good for the game. But I can't help but feeling like map bosses are a little bit lackluster in comparison to rares. I'd love to see bosses changed into more substantial fights as well. I also think that Archnemesis got off to a rough start. A fresh start is always a struggle for many players, myself included. It's when PoE is at its hardest. And this was doubly true in 3.18, where through map modifiers and Atlas passives, you could make the game a lot harder for yourself than anything we've had since 100% Delirious Tier 19 maps. If most people took their character now and fought Day 1 pre-nerf Archnemesis monsters, I expect a lot of people would be pleasantly surprised at how much easier the mobs are to handle than they remembered, both after learning what things do and building a bit more character power. Rare monsters are more of a threat than they used to be, but that's not a bad thing. And you're able to know what sort of threat they are a lot easier than in the past. It also feels like a lot of people fell for the trap of reading Reddit before playing the game for themselves. Before Sentinel started, people swore to me that RF wouldn't be viable because of Rejuvenator. Now, I'd played RF for over a month in 3.17, and I didn't even know what Rejuvenator did, because it was completely irrelevant to my build. I'd see a green pulse, I'd run away, and then I'd kill it dead. And since, in 3.18, it doesn't root you in place, nor does it disable your movement skills, Warcry or Flask, it wasn't really that bad even at the start. These rumors were much exaggerated, and many people who have played RF Inquisitor since have told me, yeah, that really wasn't a big deal, I don't know why I was so worried. Right now, a 1-mod rare is fairly simple, and a 4-mod rare is fairly complex. When I was on Fated Connections, Sir Gog had a great suggestion in regards to that. To cause Archnemesis modifiers to scale in power based on the number of mods on the enemy. So, if an Archnemesis monster had 1 mod, that mod would be at 100% effect. If it had 2, both would be at 80%. If it had 3, they'd be at 70% of normal effect. This would lead to fights that are more complicated and more engaging, without monsters feeling overwhelming due to the additional stacking of defensive bonuses. With a system like this, I could see the default for mods being raised back to 2, with the reduction back down to 1 for specific content types like Delve or Blight. Personally, I'm glad that rare monster modifiers have been modernized, and now that I've gotten about a month to play around with the new mods, they feel much better than the old ones did. I had to pay attention a lot more at first, but now I think about them less, if at all. The system isn't perfect, but it is here to stay. So, what do you think? What improvements would you like to see in regards to Archnemesis? Or maybe rares in PoE more broadly? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.